The sound of glass shattering echoed through the quiet house, but it wasn't the intruder's footsteps that startled the family. It was the sudden growl from their loyal dog. What happened next will leave you speechless and bring tears to your eyes. The small, quiet neighborhood was known for its tight-knit community, where everyone knew each other, and the sense of security was comforting. The Smith family had lived in the same house for over 10 years. It was a charming home, with a white picket fence surrounding a well-kept garden, and the sound of laughter often filled the air. It was the perfect place for a family to grow, and that's exactly what the Smiths had done. The parents, Sarah and David, were a loving couple who had 2 children, a playful 6-year-old named Lily and their newborn son, Ethan. Ethan had only been a part of the family for a few months, but already he had brought so much joy to the household. Sarah and David couldn't imagine their lives without him. But there was one other member of the Smith family who had made their home even more special. That member was Duke, their loyal golden retriever. Duke had been with Sarah and David since they first got married. He had always been their protector, a constant companion, and a best friend. When Lily was born, Duke immediately took on the role of her guardian, always watching over her as she grew, playing with her and protecting her with the fiercest loyalty. Now, as little Ethan entered their lives, Duke's protective nature extended to him as well. Sarah had always felt safe in her home, knowing that Duke was by their side. His warm, golden coat was a familiar sight as he trotted through the house, his wagging tail a constant sign of his cheerful nature. But there was a side to Duke that no one had ever truly seen, his deep, unwavering instinct to protect his family. And it was in the quiet hours of the night that these instincts would be put to the ultimate test. It was a typical evening for the Smith family. Sarah had just finished putting Ethan to sleep in his crib, while David was helping Lily with her homework at the kitchen table. The house was peaceful, with the only sounds coming from the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional rustle of pages. Duke, as always, lay by the door, his eyes scanning the hallway as he napped. He was the kind of dog who was always alert, his ears twitching at even the slightest noise. His loyalty to the family was unshakable, and Sarah often joked that he was the best security system money could buy. But tonight something was different. A strange stillness hung in the air, almost as if the house was holding its breath. Sarah couldn't quite place it, but she felt uneasy, an inexplicable tension rising in her chest. She brushed it off, focusing instead on the task at hand, but Duke, who had been lying peacefully a moment ago, suddenly stood up and walked to the door. His ears perked up, and his body tensed. He let out a low growl, his eyes locked on the door as if he could sense something, or someone, lurking outside. At first, Sarah thought it was just a noise from outside, perhaps the wind rustling the branches of a tree or a car driving by. But Duke wasn't backing down. His growl grew louder, more insistent. Sarah glanced at David, who was still focused on helping Lily. "David," she said softly, "do you hear that?" David paused, looking toward the door. At that moment, they both heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside. Someone was out there. Duke's growls intensified, his stance shifting from defensive to aggressive. His body quivered, ready to spring into action. Sarah felt a wave of concern wash over her. She knew Duke well enough to understand that he wasn't just reacting to a stray animal. This was something much more serious. Something was wrong. David stood up from the kitchen table, his protective instincts kicking in. "Stay here with Lily and Ethan," he instructed, his voice firm yet calm. He grabbed a baseball bat from the closet, ready to defend his family, but he had no idea just how much Duke was about to prove. As David cautiously approached the door, Duke's growling escalated into an ear-splitting bark. Then, without warning, the door was forced open. A figure, cloaked in darkness, stepped into the house. But before anyone could react, Duke sprang into action. The intruder didn't even have time to react before Duke lunged at him, barking furiously, protecting his family with everything he had. Sarah's heart raced. She knew the situation was serious now. As the intruder stumbled back, trying to defend himself, Duke stayed close, never letting him out of his sight. Sarah's eyes flickered to the living room, where little Ethan slept peacefully, unaware of the danger lurking outside. But she knew that Duke was there, keeping him safe. The intruder, a shadowy figure dressed in dark clothing, staggered backward as Duke continued to bark fiercely, his protective instincts fully engaged. The loud barks echoed throughout the house, reverberating in the walls, almost as if they were shaking the very foundation of their peaceful home. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, and she could feel her breath quicken. Her immediate instinct was to rush to the nursery to check on Ethan, but she couldn't leave the front door unguarded. David, still holding the baseball bat in his hands, moved swiftly toward the door, cautiously stepping over the threshold to confront the intruder. Duke was relentless, continuing to block the doorway with his large frame. He wasn't just protecting the house, he was protecting Sarah, David, and especially little Ethan. Duke had never been a violent dog, but in that moment, his fierce loyalty and protective nature were on full display. The intruder, clearly caught off guard by the dog's ferocity, looked around for an escape, but Duke wasn't going to give him the chance. The man, clearly not expecting to encounter such resistance, hesitated for a fraction of a second before attempting to retreat. David, who had been slowly inching toward the intruder, didn't waste a moment. "Stay away from my family," he shouted, brandishing the bat with a sense of authority. The intruder paused, sizing up David, but the hesitation gave Duke the perfect opportunity to pounce. Without any warning, the dog lunged forward, his powerful jaws aimed at the intruder's leg. The man yelped in pain, stumbling backward, and the sound of his muffled cry filled the air. For a brief moment, the situation seemed like it was spiraling out of control. But Duke wasn't finished. His growls became louder, more intense, as he fought to keep the intruder away from the family. The man, clearly injured, realized that he was facing more than he had bargained for. His eyes flicked toward the house, trying to figure out how to escape, but Duke was relentless. The dog wouldn't let up, his eyes locked on the intruder with unflinching focus. David, still holding the bat, stepped forward, positioning himself between the intruder and the rest of the house. "Leave now," David commanded, his voice growing firmer. He wasn't backing down, not for a second. He had seen Duke's loyalty before, but seeing him in action now was a different experience. It was as if the dog understood the gravity of the situation, and there was no way he would allow anyone to harm his family. The intruder seemed to realize that he was not going to get away easily. His breath was ragged, his face a mixture of fear and confusion. Why had this dog been so determined? Why had he fought back so fiercely when most dogs would simply bark and retreat? The man, now visibly shaken, took a few steps back, still trying to find his footing. The adrenaline that had fueled his earlier attempt to break into the house had started to fade, replaced by an overwhelming sense of self-preservation. Meanwhile, Sarah, standing just inside the living room, was desperately trying to decide what to do. Her thoughts were consumed by Ethan. She had to protect him. He was so small, so vulnerable. But she couldn't abandon David or Duke either. Every second felt like an eternity as the situation unfolded outside the door. She reached for her phone, intending to call 911, but she knew that by the time the authorities arrived, it might be too late. They needed to act now. In the hallway, Duke was still locked in an intense standoff with the intruder. The dog was on high alert, his body tense as he watched the man's every move. His growls had stopped, but his eyes were still filled with suspicion and determination. The intruder, despite his obvious pain, had started to back away, his hands raised in surrender. He was clearly no longer interested in causing trouble. It was clear that he had underestimated the power of this loyal, protective dog. David glanced back at Sarah, meeting her gaze for a brief moment. In that exchange, there was an unspoken understanding. This was far from over, and they needed to be ready. They couldn't take any chances. David stepped forward, but just as he did, Duke lunged once more, forcing the intruder to trip and fall. The man hit the ground hard, a painful thud echoing through the night. "Stay down," David shouted, his voice commanding and filled with authority. The intruder, now immobilized by both his injuries and Duke's relentless defense, finally relented. He lay on the ground, clutching his leg, his breathing labored. Duke continued to stand over him, his golden coat gleaming under the dim light, eyes never leaving the man who had dared to threaten his family. With the threat now neutralized, Sarah made a quick decision. She dashed toward the nursery, her heart still racing. "Ethan," she whispered urgently, reaching the crib in mere seconds. She found him peacefully asleep, unaware of the danger that had just occurred outside. A wave of relief washed over her, but she knew they weren't out of the woods yet. The intruder was still out there, lying helpless on their doorstep. As Sarah returned to the living room, David called 911, his voice steady despite the chaos. Duke, still watching the man with unblinking eyes, showed no signs of backing down. It was clear that, for now, the Smith family was safe, thanks to Duke's unwavering bravery and protection. But the aftermath of this frightening ordeal was just beginning to unfold. The truth of the intruder's identity, the motives behind his actions, and the consequences of this night would soon be revealed. The moment of climax arrived with a sudden intensity that gripped the entire scene. Duke, the family's fearless protector, had kept the intruder at bay, but the situation was about to take a shocking turn. The intruder, having realized the magnitude of his miscalculation, was scrambling to retreat, but his movements were faltering, his pain from Duke's earlier bite slowing him down. David stood firm in the doorway, his heart hammering in his chest. His grip tightened around a baseball bat, ready to protect his family at any cost. Duke, sensing that the intruder wasn't retreating fast enough, took a step forward, his growl intensifying as he lowered his body in preparation to pounce again. The dog's fur bristled, and his stance became more menacing. There was no question now that Duke wasn't going to let anyone enter the house. The intruder staggered backward, still wincing in pain, but desperation clouded his judgment. He glanced toward the front yard, trying to spot a way to escape, but Duke was relentless. The dog moved with incredible speed, closing the distance between them in a flash. The man, still injured, turned to run, but that was the moment when Duke's protective instincts kicked into overdrive. With a sharp yelp, the dog lunged. David's eyes widened in horror as he realized the intruder wasn't just trying to escape. He was planning something far more dangerous. He was heading straight for the backyard, where the family's garage stood, with an open window. If the intruder reached that window, he could gain access to the garage and potentially have access to tools or weapons that could turn the tide in his favor. There was no time to waste. Duke, no. David shouted, but the command was lost in the chaos. Duke was faster than ever, and in a matter of seconds, he reached the intruder, catching his leg in the process. The man let out a guttural scream, falling to the ground in agony. His body crumpled, and his breath came in sharp gasps. The intruder was now completely at Duke's mercy. The dog's jaws were locked onto the man's leg, and the pain was so intense that the intruder could barely fight back. But it wasn't just the bite that kept him immobilized. It was the sheer determination in Duke's eyes, an unwavering focus that spoke volumes about the dog's loyalty. Duke wasn't just defending the house or even David and Sarah. He was protecting his family from something far more dangerous than just a break-in. This was a matter of life and death. David took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "Don't move," he ordered, his voice steady but full of authority. He could feel the adrenaline surging through his veins, but he kept his emotions in check. The most important thing right now was keeping everyone safe. The intruder, despite his pain, attempted to crawl toward the side gate, but with Duke's powerful hold on him, he couldn't go anywhere. David was quickly at his side, pulling him back from trying to escape further into the yard. "This ends now," he said, his voice a low growl, matching the intensity of the situation. Duke's eyes never left the intruder. The dog had not budged an inch, and despite his instincts to protect the family, he also sensed that this moment was crucial. He kept his focus on the man, making sure there was no escape. His loyalty and bravery had never been more apparent than now. Sarah stood in the doorway of the living room, watching the scene unfold. Her heart was in her throat, but she trusted David's strength. She felt a wave of gratitude for Duke, who was standing strong against an intruder who had tried to break into their home. But more than that, she felt a deep, overwhelming sense of hope. This dog wasn't just a pet, he was part of their family. He had saved them, and there was no question in her mind that he would continue to do whatever it took to protect them. The tension in the air was thick, and for a moment, it felt as though time had slowed down. The intruder, now unable to move, looked up at David with a mix of fear and confusion. He had underestimated the Smith family's resolve, and most importantly, he had underestimated Duke. There was nothing more dangerous than a dog fiercely defending his pack. David moved closer, his bat still raised, as he kept a sharp eye on the intruder. The man's attempts to escape had failed, and he knew there was no way out. Duke, still holding him down, gave a low, threatening growl, signaling that he had no intention of letting the man go. David wasn't about to let this intruder hurt his family. Not now, not ever. As the intruder lay there, unable to move, David heard the faint sound of sirens in the distance. Help was on its way, but for the moment, Duke was the family's savior. He had turned what could have been a life-threatening situation into a battle of wills, one that he was determined to win. The intruder, now trapped, could only stare up at the dog who had thwarted his every move. David glanced back at Sarah, his eyes meeting hers in an unspoken moment of understanding. Their family was safe, thanks to their loyal dog, Duke, who had proven that nothing would come between him and the ones he loved. As the sound of sirens drew nearer, the tension that had gripped the air began to ease, but it was far from over. The intruder, now incapacitated on the ground, groaned in pain, the reality of his failure settling in. Duke's sharp, unwavering gaze remained fixed on him, his body still tense and ready to act if the man dared to make another move. The dog's grip on the intruder's leg remained firm, a silent promise that this would not end until the situation was fully resolved. David stood over the intruder, baseball bat in hand, watching as the man attempted to shift uncomfortably, trying to wiggle his body, clearly in pain. The bite wound from Duke was deep, and it had already caused considerable damage. The intruder, now immobilized, was helpless, unable to escape, and no longer posing a threat to the family. Still, David didn't lower his guard. He had seen enough to know that danger didn't always show itself in the obvious ways. Sarah, standing at the doorway, glanced nervously between David and the still struggling intruder. She could feel her heart racing, her breath shallow, but a deep sense of gratitude washed over her as she watched Duke. The dog had done what he was trained to do, protect them. And he had done so without hesitation, with an instinct that had never been clearer. "Stay with the kids," David called to Sarah, his voice steady but urgent. He knew she was shaken by the events, but now was not the time for her to be near the intruder. He wanted to make sure she was safe, that nothing else would go wrong in these critical moments. His eyes never left the man on the ground as he carefully backed away, his hands still gripping the bat. Sarah nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat, and hurried inside to check on the children. They were safe as far as she could tell, but the fear of what could have happened still lingered in the back of her mind. She quickly locked the door to the room where they were playing and took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. The adrenaline of the situation had not worn off, but the knowledge that Duke had protected him helped calm her. David remained focused on the intruder, though the situation was changing rapidly. The sound of sirens grew louder as the police approached the house. He could already see their flashing lights cutting through the night, the arrival of help offering a sense of relief. Yet he stayed on high alert, not yet willing to let his guard down completely. It was still unclear what the intruder's intentions had been. Was this a random act of violence, or was there a deeper reason behind the break-in? Duke, sensing the approach of the authorities, finally relaxed his stance but did not let go of the intruder. He was not about to release his grip until David gave the order. His loyalty to the family was unmatched, and even though the immediate danger had passed, the dog knew better than anyone that he needed to stay vigilant until the police arrived. The lights of the patrol cars flashed through the windows as they pulled up to the driveway. A few seconds later, officers rushed to the front door, their voices commanding and authoritative. David moved aside, still holding the bat, as two officers approached the intruder, pulling him away from Duke's hold. "Step back, sir," one of the officers instructed, directing David away from the scene. He obeyed, but not without a lingering sense of protectiveness. The officers quickly cuffed the intruder and began questioning him, their professional demeanor taking over the chaotic moment. David could feel the weight of the situation lifting as the officers began taking control. The immediate threat had been neutralized, and Duke was finally able to relax. His tense posture softened as the police secured the intruder, his protective instincts still very much on alert but now in a more passive state. Sarah emerged from the house, her face pale but determined. She was grateful beyond words that her family had been kept safe, but the weight of the night's events still hung heavily in the air. As she stepped toward David, she couldn't help but give Duke an affectionate pat on the head. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "You were amazing, Duke." "Thank you." David smiled at Sarah, his own relief evident in his eyes. He looked down at Duke, his heart swelling with pride for the dog who had not only saved their lives but had also prevented a tragedy. "He's the real hero tonight," David said, his voice full of admiration. The police officers finished their questioning of the intruder and began taking him away. The man's eyes glazed over with defeat. He had underestimated the family, their strength, and most of all, the loyalty of Duke. As the officers drove him away, David and Sarah stood together, their children safe inside the house, their hearts filled with gratitude. As the officers left the scene, the night finally began to settle into a quiet calm. The rush of adrenaline had begun to subside, leaving a stillness in its wake. Yet in that quiet, there was one thing that rang true. They had faced a harrowing ordeal and come out stronger for it. Thanks to Duke's unwavering courage and the family's resolve, the situation had been resolved with no casualties. David turned to Sarah, their hands meeting in a comforting embrace. "We're safe," he whispered, relief flooding through him. "Thanks to Duke," Sarah replied, her voice soft but filled with immense gratitude. The family had faced a terrifying moment, but together, with Duke's protection, they had emerged unscathed. The night would end as it had begun, with peace, love, and a profound sense of appreciation for their loyal protector. As the night began to calm, an uneasy tension lingered in the air. The police had taken the intruder into custody, and the family was finally starting to breathe again. However, just when it seemed like the worst was over, a sense of unease crept in. Duke, the family's heroic dog, was now resting on the floor by the door, his alert eyes still darting toward the shadows. His protective instincts hadn't fully relaxed, and neither had the family's. They had lived through an ordeal, and although the immediate danger had passed, the fear of what could have happened was still fresh in their minds. David stood by the window, watching as the patrol cars pulled away, the flashing lights slowly fading into the distance. The silence that followed felt like an unsettling calm. He turned to Sarah, his face etched with worry. What if there's more to this than we know? What if he wasn't alone? Sarah had the same thought, though she hadn't voiced it. The intruder had been alone, or at least that was what the police had told them, but something about the entire situation didn't sit right. Why had the intruder targeted their house in particular? The night had been too strange, too sudden. It felt like there were pieces missing from the puzzle, and those missing pieces nagged at the back of their minds. "Duke," Sarah said softly, her voice trembling slightly. She approached their dog, sitting by the door. His fur was still bristling, and his ears twitched at the slightest sound. "You're all right, boy. It's over." But Duke's behavior suggested otherwise. His body was tense, his gaze fixed on the shadows outside. It was as if he could sense something they couldn't. The family's sense of security was slowly beginning to erode, and the fear that had once gripped their hearts began to surge again, stronger this time. The unknown was still out there, lingering just beyond the threshold. David walked to the door, checking the locks one more time before looking back at Sarah. "I think we should stay up a little longer, just to make sure." "I'll keep watch for a bit." Sarah nodded, her own nerves still frayed from the events. She sat down on the couch, wrapping a blanket around herself as she glanced at Duke. The dog's unwavering vigilance was a stark reminder that the night wasn't as over as they hoped. The weight of the situation pressed on her chest, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the danger was far from gone. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the trees in the distance. The darkness beyond their house seemed more ominous now. A gust of wind rattled the window, causing Sarah to jump slightly. Her heart raced again, a knot of fear forming in her stomach. It was just the wind, she told herself, but the feeling of vulnerability was still there. Then Duke began to growl low in his throat. It wasn't a sound of play or excitement. It was the growl of a dog on high alert. David, now standing near the door, immediately stiffened, his hand instinctively going to the baseball but he had left by the door after the earlier confrontation. "Duke, what is it?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear. She had never seen the dog so unnerved. He had always been protective, but this was different. There was something else in the air, something that made his instinctual sense of danger flare to life. The minutes ticked by, each one more agonizing than the last. The house, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now seemed vulnerable, exposed to the night. It was almost as if the events of earlier hadn't fully played out. Something about the intrusion didn't add up, and they were still grappling with the unknown threat lurking just beyond their home. David scanned the darkness outside through the blinds. There was nothing out of the ordinary, no shadows moving, no figures lurking in the trees. But Duke's growls grew louder, more insistent. David's grip on the bat tightened, and he motioned for Sarah to stay back. "Stay here," he told her, his voice firm. "I'm going to check the yard." Sarah's pulse quickened, and she reached out to grab his arm. "Please be careful. Don't go out there alone." David met her gaze, his expression set in determination. "It's just a quick check. Stay with the kids and lock all the doors." Before Sarah could respond, he was out the door, his eyes scanning the yard. The wind howled again, making the trees creak and sway. Duke's growls escalated to barks, and Sarah could barely keep herself from running outside after him. She kept her eyes glued to the door, waiting, hoping that David would come back inside unharmed. Suddenly, there was a noise, a rustle near the bushes. A shadow flickered, and Duke's barking intensified. Sarah's heart raced, her mind reeling. Was it the intruder coming back? Had he brought reinforcements? Fear surged through her as she rushed to the window, only to be met with the sight of David standing alone, looking toward the shadows. "Dad," she whispered to herself. "What's going on?" David held his ground as the night seemed to close in around him. The intruder may have been taken away, but now there was something else, an unrelenting presence that had returned, threatening to unravel their peace. Duke's constant vigilance suggested that danger had returned to their doorstep once more. It was no longer clear who or what they were up against. The true test of survival, it seemed, was just beginning. David stood at the edge of the yard, his grip still firm on the bat, his eyes scanning the shadows. Duke, the family's loyal protector, had gone silent for a moment, his ears perked, waiting for any sign of movement. The tension in the air was palpable, each passing second stretched like an eternity. Despite the wind's eerie howls, everything felt still, too still. David's heart hammered in his chest as he moved cautiously toward the corner of the yard. His mind raced with thoughts of what could be lurking in the darkness. Had the intruder returned? Or was it something else? The sense of danger was undeniable, but the yard appeared empty. No figures, no shapes moving in the darkness, just the quiet rustling of the leaves. "Duke?" David called softly, his voice barely above a whisper. The dog, standing by his side, lifted his head and sniffed the air, but his attention remained fixed on the darkened woods beyond the yard. David knew that Duke was a seasoned guard dog, but tonight there was something in his behavior that was different, something more unsettling. His growls had stopped, but his body remained tense, ready for anything. David took a deep breath and turned back to the house, his feet crunching on the gravel as he moved slowly toward the door. Sarah was inside, no doubt anxiously waiting, her concern for him and their children growing with each moment. They had already been through so much that night. What was he supposed to tell her if the danger wasn't over? As he stepped through the door, the warm, comforting light of the house felt almost foreign after the tense darkness outside. Sarah was waiting by the window, her face pale, eyes wide with worry. She didn't say anything at first, just searched his face for any signs of what had happened outside. "David," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Is it over?" David nodded, though uncertainty lingered in his chest. "I think so," he said, trying to sound confident. He motioned to the kids, who were huddled in the corner of the living room, still visibly shaken by the night's events. Everyone's safe. The intruder's gone. But Sarah could sense the weight of the moment hanging heavily between them. They both knew it wasn't just the intruder they were worried about anymore. The fear had gone deeper, into something more primal. The unknown had crept into their home, and even though the immediate danger had passed, the unsettling feeling that something else could happen was hard to shake. Duke trotted into the living room, his fur still bristled, his eyes alert. He stopped by the children, sitting down beside them, his usual calm demeanor replaced by the vigilance of a guard dog who'd sensed something they couldn't. His presence, however, seemed to offer some comfort. There was no immediate threat, but his watchfulness reminded them that safety, however fleeting, was not guaranteed. Sarah knelt beside the dog, running a hand over his fur. "You did so well, Duke," she murmured. "Thank you for protecting us." The family stood together in the living room, the quiet of the house now feeling more like a silence of reflection rather than peace. The adrenaline that had coursed through them earlier was giving way to a wave of exhaustion. But there was still a question lingering in their minds. Why had the intruder come here in the first place? Why had Duke been so attuned to the danger, even before they could fully comprehend it? David glanced at Sarah, his brow furrowed. "I think we need to keep an eye on things for a little while longer. I'm not sure this was just a random break-in." Sarah nodded, understanding his unease. They had both experienced enough over the past few hours to know that sometimes things weren't as they appeared. It was possible that the intruder wasn't working alone, or perhaps they were involved in something much more dangerous. But for now, there was nothing more they could do. They hugged the children tightly, offering words of reassurance, though each of them knew that the night would linger in their memories for some time. No one would forget the image of Duke, bravely standing between their home and the threat that had tried to breach it. David pulled out his phone and called the police one last time to confirm their suspicions and ensure everything was secure. It seemed like the right step, though his gut told him there was more to this story. As the evening wore on, a sense of calm finally began to settle over the family. They locked the doors again, closed the blinds, and checked every corner of the house. It was hard to shake the feeling that the world outside was full of threats they couldn't always see. But for tonight, they would stay together, safe within the walls of their home. David sat down on the couch beside Sarah, his arm around her as they both looked at the children, who were now resting peacefully, their minds lulled by the safety of the moment. Duke lay by the door, still on alert, but now with the certainty that the immediate danger had passed. "We're safe," David whispered, more to reassure himself than anything else. And in that moment, surrounded by the love of his family and the loyalty of their brave dog, he felt a fragile sense of peace return. The intruder may have left, but the love, courage, and protection that surrounded them would remain. They would face whatever came next, together. And as the night drew to a close, the family fell into a quiet, cautious sleep, knowing that tomorrow was a new day, and with it, the promise of a future where they were safe from harm. As dawn broke over the horizon, the warmth of the early morning sun filtered through the windows, casting a soft golden glow on the family's home. The tension that had gripped them the previous night had slowly faded, replaced by a quiet sense of gratitude. The day felt different, soothing and peaceful, yet still touched by the events that had unfolded. David woke first, the familiar rhythm of the morning returning. He stretched his arms and glanced over at Sarah, still sleeping peacefully beside him. Their children were in the next room, still tucked under their blankets, blissfully unaware of the night's terrifying ordeal. His gaze then drifted toward the corner where Duke lay, the family's faithful guardian. Duke's eyes met his, and for a moment, the two shared an unspoken understanding. The dog had been more than just a pet. He had been the protector, the brave soul who had kept his family safe. Without him, they might have faced an entirely different outcome. David sat up, running a hand over his face, a quiet sigh escaping his lips. The terror of the night had been real, but the love and loyalty that surrounded them were undeniable. They had come through the ordeal as a family, bound together by an unbreakable bond. But even with the relief that came with the rising sun, questions remained. What was the true motivation behind the intruder's actions? Who had sent him, and why? The uncertainty lingered in the back of David's mind, but for now, there was little more they could do. The sound of the children stirring from the other room broke David's thoughts. He stood, moving towards the door to greet them, feeling a sense of purpose that had been reignited. It was time to reassure his family that they were safe, that they would continue to protect each other no matter what the world threw their way. Sarah woke shortly after, stretching and yawning, her eyes meeting David's. "How's everything?" she asked softly, her voice still thick with sleep but laced with concern. "We're all right," David replied with a small smile. "We made it through the night." Duke, sensing the start of a new day, jumped up and trotted over to Sarah, his tail wagging as he nudged her hand for attention. She smiled and patted his head, grateful for the presence of such a loyal and protective companion. The family gathered together in the living room, the children asking questions about the events of the previous night. David and Sarah kept their explanations simple, focusing on reassuring them that they were safe now, that the bad man was gone, and that they would be okay. They couldn't shield their kids from the world forever, but for now, they could protect them in this moment. As the day went on, the family went about their usual activities. Sarah took care of breakfast, the children played, and David spent time cleaning up the yard, double-checking the security of the house. Despite the normalcy of the day, there was an underlying sense of vigilance, of knowing that danger could strike when least expected. But as long as they were together, they would face it as a family. David made a call to the authorities to follow up on the investigation, but there was no new information yet. The intruder had disappeared into the night, leaving behind only questions and a lingering sense of unease. Still, David knew that it was only a matter of time before answers came. And whatever the outcome, he would be ready to face it with the strength of his family and their loyal protector by his side. The family gathered around the dinner table later that evening, laughter and chatter filling the room. They had made it through one of the most harrowing nights of their lives, but they had emerged stronger for it. The fear had been real, but so had their love and resilience. It was these qualities that would guide them forward through whatever challenges they might face in the future. As they sat together, their hearts full, David couldn't help but reflect on the incredible bravery of their dog. Duke had put his own safety aside to protect his family, a reminder of the power of loyalty, courage, and love. The bond between a family and their pet was something special, and in that moment, David couldn't be more grateful for the trust and devotion they shared. Now, as the night descended once again, the house was quiet, but the atmosphere had changed. The fear that had consumed them just hours before was gone, replaced by the comfort of knowing that they were not alone. They had faced the unknown, and in doing so, they had learned that the most important thing was the strength they had within each other. Conclusion. In life, we may face moments of uncertainty, moments when fear tries to take hold of us. But it is in these moments that the true measure of our strength emerges. Whether it's the love and courage of a family or the bravery of a loyal companion, we are capable of overcoming challenges when we stand together. Let this story of resilience and loyalty serve as a reminder that no matter what you face, you're never truly alone. And just like Duke, you too can be the protector, the one who stands firm in the face of adversity, ensuring that those you love are safe. If you believe in the power of loyalty and love, and if this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible tales of bravery and courage. Stay strong, stay united, and always protect the ones you love.